Okay. Okay. Carl,
Good
take
morning.
one.
Good morning, everybody. Good evening, wherever you are. From the ARPA Institute, I welcome you all. I'm Hacopian, and this is the ARPA Institute panel discussion on Artsakh 2026. A few things about what ARPA is and what ARPA does. ARPA has been working in Armenia since 1992 for 30 years, and this year it's the 30th anniversary of ARPA, which we are going to celebrate with a one-day conference and a banquet on June 11th. You're all welcome. We are hoping that we can do it in person, but in case of the COVID situation, it may end up being online as well. ARPA Institute works with the government of Armenia and the universities and the Academy of Sciences, trying to help advance science, engineering, technology, medicine, health, education, and various other areas. ARPA is composed of experts from all fields, and our main objective is to help Armenia through our expertise. Our current activities include the most important one being a clean room, the first 1,000 class clean room in Armenia, which is being located in the Ana Ohanians National Lab. And the main objective of that is to let the scientists in Armenia and the researchers be able to do very sensitive experimentation and create some innovative materials. Also, we have worked with the government of Armenia to establish the process of science fairs in all schools of Armenia. For those of you from the US, you know what a science fair is. And we believe that that is a very important project-oriented approach to education and would help the students think innovatively and do solve problems using the scientific method. We also have our annual invention competition for young scientists, which is ongoing now. And we ask scientists and graduate students if they have any inventions, they can apply and win up to $5,000 depending on their innovation. And if the innovation is worthy of pursuing further to become a product, we try to help them and make it into a product. We also have other activities, but due to time constraints, I would like you all to go to our website, arpainstitute.org, and read about our activities. Our annual newsletter will be coming out soon, and we will forward that to you. And that summarizes essentially our activities in the past year. If we have your email address, that means you are receiving our emails, and therefore our activities are always advertised through emails. If you know a friend who is interested, please send us their email address. And also, our activities are all volunteer, and the only way we can help Armenia and advance all these activities that we have is through donations from you, from the community. So if you think that ARPA is doing a good job, please go to our website and donate to ARPA. Thank you. And our now moderator is our own Dr. Ana Ohanians, who is the director of the Children's Educational Center in Loyola Marymount University. Ani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Panosian, and thank you for joining us. Good morning and good evening to those of you tuning in from Armenia, including one of our guest speakers here today. I would like to thank the ARPA Institute for featuring this conversation on Artsakh 2026, Prospects for the Future with Eric Hacopian, Dr. Ana Ohanians, Dr. Nerses Kopalyan. Through their steadfast work in Armenia, as Dr. Panosyan was just mentioning, the ARPA Institute continues to serve as a steady reminder for us all that progress can be made together. We find ourselves in a renewed era of great power politics, with Russia reasserting their dominance and control over what was historically their sphere of influence. This will no doubt create instability and give purchase to the idea that force can be used to achieve irredentist ambitions. Artsakh, which is in a state of play between Armenia and Azerbaijan, is still at a ceasefire, not an end of war. And the Russian mandate will end in 2026. There is a tremendous amount of uncertainty of what Artsakh will be. What we have now is a very limited Artsakh compared to what we had. What does that mean in and of itself? Is it a truly viable entity, or will it survive without patrons? Our objective with our time here today is to share some of the thinking about the ceasefire that remains fragile between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and what will happen after the mandate is terminated. These esteemed panelists will address their thoughts on this issue and analyze some of the key political and international implications. I look forward to all of us listening closely and engaging with our speakers. I would like to give voice to you, and so I will ask a series of questions that I think the audience would like to hear. And what I don't address, I will devote some time for the audience to do so by writing their questions in the chat box towards the end of the presentation. And so let me tell you a bit about our guest speakers here today. Eric Hacopian. Eric Hacopian is a 30-year veteran of American politics, having worked on campaigns from the local to the presidential level. For the past 22 years, he has been the principal at EDH and Associates and a Southern California-based Democratic consulting firm. In 2017, Eric moved to Armenia and has been living there ever since. Dr. Ana Ohanians. She is the Richard B. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Stonehill College, and two-time Fulbright Scholar to the South Caucasus. She has authored several books and published numerous articles in both academic journals as well as various mainstream media outlets. Professor Ohanians served as a doctoral fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She has consulted for numerous organizations such as the United Nations Foundation, the World Bank, the National Intelligence Council Project, the US Department of State, the Carter Center, and USAID. Finally, we have Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, an assistant professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. His fields of specialization include international relations, geopolitics, political theory, and philosophy of science. He has conducted extensive research on polarity, superpower relations, and security studies. He has authored books as well as written 2 policy papers for the Republic of Armenia, and serves as an advisor to the Office of the High Commissioner for Diaspora Affairs. His current focus is on geopolitical and great power relations with an emphasis on Eurasia. Thank you each for your time here today. So, in the spirit that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards, for our viewers here today, I'd like to begin by briefly situating the current issues facing Artsakh from a historical perspective and setting the stage to more detailed discussion. So Eric, can you situate us a little bit historically? I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about when and how did the current boundaries of Azerbaijan and Armenia form?
Well, I mean, primarily, it was during the first independence, which was 1918 to 1920 for both countries. But the current format of what is Artsakh was actually what was NKR, which was the unautonomous region that was placed inside of Azerbaijan in the 1920s by Soviet authorities. Specifically, it was primarily a decision made by Stalin because originally even the Azeri leadership had wanted to give Artsakh over to Armenia. some of this frankly didn't matter because you were all part of the same country. However, Stalin, for whatever reason, which is still disputed today, reversed that decision and decided to put Artsakh within Azeri territory, however, with an autonomous status, which it is this sort of the uneasy settlement that it had until 1991. And the reason it had the uneasy settlement is because the Soviet Union was there to enforce it and nothing was going to change anyway. So there was it was a relatively peaceful time in which Armenians are obviously oppressed to the extent that the Azeri authorities had any say in it, but they were also protected on some level. They were, no one had particular rights in that country anyway. So, but there was, and after 1991 and the settlement fell apart, there was an attempt on the Azeri side to essentially ethnically cleanse Artsakh of Armenians, which failed, which we had 28 years of an uneasy peace, which was followed up by another ethnic cleansing that almost succeeded, or succeeded in part, which brings us to today. And this is a very layman's explanation.
Oh, it's
of the
perfect.
background,
Perfect.
but it's not scholarly, let's say that.
But it's exactly what we need to understand, sort of. And if you want to expand a little bit about this, what is the source of hatred between the two countries?
Well, I mean, frankly, this is not just political. This is sort of a sociological or anthropological question. I think for Armenians, Artsakh represents given the trauma of what we had lost 100 years ago, it was something that we didn't lose 28 years ago. So it's seen in the context of something that was kept or regained when we had suffered. Essentially, we were pushed out of 80% of the places that we lived for multiple millennia. And the Artsakh Armenians are probably the only Armenians ever that have not been entirely wiped out from where they lived. Every other group of Armenians have been pushed around from place to place. So it almost had this mythic idea for us, and that victory meant a lot to people, especially to diasporans and to people here. I think for the Azeris, it's different in the sense that their entire modern national narrative, which is really post-independence, is their identity is a negative identity. It's essentially an identity of who they're not and who they hate. And in this case, it's Armenians. So the part of the zeitgeist of the state or the nation has become to regain Artsakh and to ethnically cleanse Armenians out of those lands. And their culture and the country and the political life of that country has been defined with that. And given the fact that it's a totalitarian state, it is a way for the totalitarian state to distract people from the serious problems that the country has, specifically that they're actually the poorest country in the Caucasus per capita income, given the fact that they have the most massive resources in the area. So it's a failing political system, and failing political systems need outside enemies, and there's no better cultural other for their purposes than Armenians. So you have these competing narratives where both they mean that Artsakh itself has this sort of become has symbolic value and real value that is very meaningful to both sides for different reasons. I would say one far more valid than the other, but you have to understand where the other side is coming from. And I think they've defined themselves with this.
They, as in?
I mean, first of all, we have to be very careful. When you talk about Azerbaijan, there's really no such thing. You're talking about, as a political entity, you're talking about Aliyev. Now, Aliyev is Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan is Aliyev. So this notion that, there's no moral equivalency between these two sides when it comes to politics, because we're all of our faults. We're semi-functional democratic state, while they're becoming an ever more backward, reactionary sultanate with racialist, fascist ideas. So I think we have to be careful when we don't want to fall into the trap of this both-sidism, because both sides are not equal. We're certainly equal as human beings, but we're not equal as political cultures. But that's what I meant.
No, excellent. Can you speak a little bit to, okay, we're fast forwarding now to a year and a half ago or so. Can you speak a little bit to why did Moscow decide to interfere? Was it incentivized from Baku or Ankara? What do you think the role of Moscow was?
Well, as far as interfere or intervene,
Running
when?
interference, yeah.
Well, I mean, are you talking about the first attempt at a ceasefire?
Yes.
Okay, well, I mean, I think for multiple reasons. Armenia is a patron state in some ways. And it's also the place where they project influence in an area that wants to, for the most part, push them out, whether it's Georgia or Azerbaijan. Both of those countries took great pride in making sure that there's no Russian bases and sort of, they have a political culture that's hostile. Armenia is the only place that isn't anti-Russian. It wasn't even before the war. Doesn't mean people love Russia, but people understand the needs of the security needs of the country, especially via Turkey. So I think Armenia was a client state one, and they were the dominant power in the region, and they can say the war ends, and it ends, which is what happened in 2016. I mean, 2016 is somewhat complicated because the Azeris themselves stopped the war, and they wanted to actually stop it a day before we did. But that's a whole different other issue.
Right.
And then the real mystery, and I think this sort of leads to the main thrust of this talk, is the day that this war ended on November 9th. There was no reason for the other side to end the war because we were losing. Right. We were a few days away from having our armies be trapped from behind, very possibly. We were a few days away from complete catastrophe, right. A complete ethnic cleansing and the destruction of Artsakh. Now that's harsh for us to. We have to admit that. We have to understand that. So something happened at that point which we do not know.
That's what I was going to ask.
Now,
yeah, how did
nobody
Moscow
knows? Nobody has that. No, well, I mean, the only way you convince is you threaten.
Yeah.
That's the only way you convince. So, which sort of leads to the primary question of today.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sort of getting ahead of ourselves. But the truth of the matter is, if you're looking at probabilities, this is a game of probabilities for the most part. If the Russians could threaten on that night and end the war, this notion that short of a collapse or some kind of a political crisis in Russia, that Aliyev is going to say, hey, you pick up and you go, knowing that he knows the Russians really well. Frankly, culturally, he's very close to them. This is the culture he grew up in.
Exactly.
It's probably his first language. It's where also a good part of his wealth is hidden. It's not just in London. So this notion that suddenly he's going to say, oh, well, you guys have to go. Everyone knows historically when the Russians come, they don't leave. And if you go back, since the Russians got to the Caucasus in the 18th century, they have pulled out twice, and they never even pulled out entirely. And those were driven by the Russian Revolution, the Soviet collapse. Nothing else did that. So unless the equivalent of something like that happens, the likelihood that the Russians are going to be asked to leave is not very high. Now, there are always black swan events that can happen. Or you could have a very nationalist regime in Baku that comes in after Aliyev that might ask the Russians to leave. But asking the Russians to leave and having them leave are entirely two different things.
Right.
And especially
sorry to interrupt, Eric.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you explain to our audience what you mean by a black swan event that could occur?
Black swan is like a just a one-off event that's not very likely, where everything has to line up in a weird way. And frankly, last year's war and the result of it on some level was a black swan event. There's no COVID last year. We probably don't have a war. So it's like everything has to line up in a specific way, and that's what's necessary. That's what's necessary to. That's the most. If you do the game of probabilities, that's what we're looking at. I want to stop now because I think you need to engage other people.
Okay, so thank you. Now I'm going to open it up Dr. Kapalian, Nerses, would you please talk a little bit about the link between the domestic and regional developments? I'm going to move a little bit away from the history to the current day. And if you can talk a little bit about how are the domestic political configurations in Armenia affecting or shaping Armenia's ability to maximize its posturing for potential complications that may arise in 2026?
Thank you, Ani. What we've seen in the post-war period at the initial stages were the concerns are going to have expansive political instability in Armenia. Immediately after the signing of the trilateral agreement, this was kind of the case. You saw a group of, thugs, operatives, however you want to qualify them, storming the government offices, the National Assembly, attacking the speaker of that so on and so forth. And so this brought about a lot of fears of instability, sort of, proliferating throughout Armenia's political field. And of course, when you have domestic instability, your capacity, your ability to engage in external negotiations, to reaffirm your security architecture, to engage in robust diplomacy becomes inherently limited. So these were the initial concerns that we were gauging after the ceasefire or the trilateral agreement was signed. Interestingly, what we've seen since 2008 has been some degree of development in Armenia's political culture. It's been limited, but we've seen a burgeoning democratic political culture. And what this demonstrated was, even in the midst of loss, in the midst of all the chaos that the 2020 war brought, Armenian citizens, the vast majority, did not turn to the type of developments that we thought or we feared could happen. And that in fact, we were able to address the domestic issues through institutions, through democratic means, and through elections. And so this relative stability did provide some foundation for Armenia to begin addressing the post-war crisis and the post-war situation. Azerbaijan was very, very aware of this. That's why as soon as Azerbaijan or Baku saw that Armenia was able to resolve its domestic complications through legal means, their next option was to basically infringe into our borders and thus create further problems. And so Armenia's domestic instability has been an important part of Baku's grand strategy in kind of either obstructing or maximizing their positions when it comes to negotiating or putting pressure on Armenia. And so there is obviously a very important link between domestic factors, domestic stability, the domestic coherence of institutions and the functionality of the government, and how this is translating to developments that we're seeing at the regional level. So in that context, the relative stability, and right now, actually, Armenia's domestic landscape has become rather stable. One could say in the last 2 months specifically. And that hopefully—
Can you speak to that a little bit? How so? How is the stability
Right. Well, the election results gave the the post-Velvet government thing, civic contract, the Pashinyan government, sort of the mandate, if you will, because they were able to win a very robust majority in parliament. And so when the political party, when the government in power loses a war, and yet they win elections, fair and free democratic elections, by a very, very large margin, over 30%, this suggests that Armenian society does consider them the only viable alternative in addressing the problems that the country faces. And so after having secured a robust majority in parliament and reforming a government with Nikol Pashinyan as prime minister, what you saw is this capacity of having a mandated majority dominance in parliament limited the political actors or those forces in the political field from being able to create more instability. And there were attempts, and we could say that whatever one may think of the opposition, most of these attempts are actually within the constitutional parameters. So there weren't really no robust activities by the opposition that were outside of the law. Was the line blurred at times? Of course it was, but fundamentally these initial attempts at creating instability, reshaping the narrative, utilizing the resources and the monetary capabilities that the previous regime had to destabilize Armenia's political climate did not work. And through time, we've seen that in the last 5-6 months, as these attempts have basically diminished, slowed down, because there has been no effect, it has not resonated with Armenian society. The outcome has been basically relative political stability. So protests, for example, have become very, very minimal. The political discourse is no longer as, one would say, vulgar or polarized as it used to be. It's still there, but it's not as bad. And one could also say the Armenian citizens, the citizenry, to a large extent, has become rather content, and they accept the existing government, the current political status quo, as being normal. And so this sense of normalization, and it's not a question of that if that's good or bad or what the situation
Right,
be, just
right.
an objective assessment. That sense of normalization has brought about political stability.
Stability.
So that's where we stand now. And this is very interesting because it has been able to absorb a lot of shocks. You know, the Azeri incursions were designed to create shockwaves in the political field. It led to shockwaves culturally, a sense of security, as far as collective emotions of the Armenian realm is concerned, but it did not resonate to citizens basically rising up against the government. And even after every, aside from incursions, the sort of the instigation of localized violence that we're seeing Azerbaijan do, whether it's in Gevarkunik, whether in November when I was there was this huge operation in Sisyan. And there was one obviously about 2 weeks ago. Azerbaijan keeps reinitiating these sort of border skirmishes, but that does not resonate to any political instability in Armenia. So it appears that the Armenian citizen is able to compartmentalize what Azerbaijan is doing, and they do not connect that with the functioning or the capabilities of the current government, and that to some extent has contributed to domestic stability. And the assumption is that this stability will hopefully resonate into more consistent and functional negotiations or attempts at addressing the problems. And to kind of quickly tie this to the geopolitical factors, we have to be very honest about this. Russia's role is the determining factor as to how Armenia, or how far Armenia could go in respects to getting something out of these negotiations or out of the process itself. We all can see that Armenia obviously is in a very, very weak position right now, but if it was not the relatively speaking security architecture, regionally speaking, that Russia provides, Armenia's position would have been much, much weaker. And this isn't a case of Russia doing Armenia any favors, but rather Russia's national interests just happen to be aligned with the situation at hand. But fundamentally, domestic stability plus the role that Russia is playing to offer Armenia some geopolitical cover, considering the weak position we are in, is playing a big role in allowing us to understand where we stand right now.
Exactly. I'm sorry, I meant to agree, but also say, Turkey is manned by Russian armies, right? Massive Russian deployment inside Armenia proper. Would you say, they are committed to defending Armenia, but not so much Artsakh at this point? What would you say the only reason sort of Artsakh continues to exist is through the support from Armenia and the blessing of Russia?
So these are two different questions. Russia
Right.
has been guarding Armenia's border towards Turkey since independence, because Armenia just never has had the manpower, the capabilities to do that. So the huge military base that the Russians have in Gyumri and the Russian presence there is designed to basically protect Armenia's borders from any issues with Turkey that may arise. The issue of Artsakh is very separate because Russia has never recognized Artsakh to be part of Armenia. So whether it's Armenia's bilateral security agreements with Russia from 1997, or whether it's Armenia's membership in CSTO, in these configurations, these assessments, Artsakh is not considered to be part of Armenia proper. Therefore, the Russian position has been whatever happens in Artsakh does not trigger any Russian security obligation towards Armenia. So Russian involvement had been made clear for a very long time that Russia is not going to get involved in an Artsakh conflict to support Armenia. So in that context, Russia's objective is to protect Armenia's, one would say sovereignty, or Armenia's basically security. That of course now brings up the question: what about the fact that you have Azeri troops within Armenia proper, and why isn't Russia doing
Right.
anything? Russia qualifies those developments as sort of being very minor border issues. Russia's argument is that after the war, because the borders have not been demarcated, they have not been finalized, there's lack of clarity. Let the process play out, and then we'll decide if the Azeri presence is in itself a violation of Russia-Armenian bilateral security arrangements or not. Now, of course, that's a cop-out. We all know that. Okay. But Russia is also playing a very important strategic game because it creates further dependency for Armenia. So the more complicated the security situation is between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the more dependency there is from Armenia on Russia, and also the regional factor that the Russian involvement becomes more acute in solving these issues. So the more problems you have, the more resolutions you need, the more of a Russian presence is required. That's kind of the factor. As far as the security of Artsakh is concerned, to be quite honest, Armenia has really no role in securing Artsakh's security after the war, because its military presence is pretty much defined by the Russian presence.
Right.
And so the Russian peacekeepers or the peacemakers, depends how you define it, translate the concept, because in Russian there's a translational issue there. But the Russian military presence there is designed to not only secure Artsakh's population, but also to reestablish Russia's interest in the region. Most of us who study this know that, since 1994, every piece of proposal that Russia has produced has stipulated the presence of Russian troops. And so Russia finally was able to get their troops in Artsakh after the war. And so the presence of those troops are inherently defined by having an Armenian population in Artsakh. And so it is within Russia's interest to maintain Artsakh's population and relative security, if you will, from any further Azeri incursions. And so the dynamics here are inherently multi-tiered, but fundamentally, as long as Armenia's or Artsakh's interests are aligned with Russia, you would see some progress that is beneficial to the Armenian side. If you see a diversion of interests, then that's when it gets rather complicated.
Because at that point, the Russian peacekeepers, or is it peacemakers, Narcissus, am I saying it?
The Russian translation is interesting. The Russian translation means peacemakers, but we translate it into peacekeepers. It's used interchangeably, which is very interesting. But yes, go ahead.
We can all agree that if their dominance didn't exist, then the Azeris would have probably taken all of Artsakh.
Oh, absolutely. Listen, it was very evident by November 8 that the defense of Stepanakert has pretty much had been lost by virtue of having lost Shushi. So the Azeris could have very, very well marched into Stepanakert, and also because the defenses in Martuni were at the verge of collapse. So without the Russian interference or Russia basically stopping the fighting, this was a foregone conclusion. So in that context, the Russian presence did stop or preserve whatever we have of Artsakh at this point.
Okay, thank you. What do you think, now this is a bigger question, we'll break it up, but what do you think will happen after the 5-year agreement period ends?
So this is very interesting. When the ceasefire was signed, and I was involved in a couple of panels, and interestingly, there were some people from Baku, think tankers as they design themselves or whatever they are. And their argument was they were fully convinced that Russia's a very rational actor. Russia respects and appreciates the fact that Azerbaijan stopped the fighting. Therefore, Russia would basically pay back Azerbaijan by leaving in 5 years, that the Russian presence is not going to be extensive. So I think Baku was convinced when they signed the trilateral agreement that the Russian presence was going to be temporary. They won more in this war than they had initially expected. The speed of their ability to guarantee some scope of victory was a lot quicker than they had anticipated. So in this sort of euphoria that they found themselves in, they thought they had gained more than they had initially anticipated. So signing the ceasefire and not antagonizing Russia made sense to him. And then they were operating under the logic that Russia would appreciate this, and in 5 years they would leave. So that had been the initial Azeri position. In the last year, of course, this has changed, and Azerbaijan has become very skeptical whether Russia would leave or not. And so you are seeing a lot more antagonistic comments coming out of Baku and a lot of critical comments coming out of Baku. So Azerbaijan is developing concerns. Is Baku going to agree in 2026 for the Russian troops to stay? I don't think so. They are going to basically present their opposition. Is that going to work? No, it's not. Because right now, Azerbaijan has basically no authority when it comes to the Lachin corridor or when it comes to, Nagorno-Karabakh as it stands right now with its Armenian population. This is completely controlled by Russia. Those of us who have visited the region, for example, right, you go through Russian checkpoints, the Russians either allow you or don't allow you. Russia administers the region right now. Okay, so technically, Russia to some extent exercises sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh.
Right.
For Azerbaijan to be able to basically push Russia out of it is really beyond its capabilities, unless there's some incentive provided to Russia, which Russia would act accordingly, but that's really not the case. So I don't see Russia leaving in 2026. I do see continuous Russian presence. I do see something very similar that we've seen in South Ossetia, in Transnistria, in Moldova. The Russian presence is going to be continuous, and not simply because Russians want to have troops on the ground, but also there are important geostrategic considerations. Armenia and Artsakh are part of Russia's southern security flank. It's a big part of their broader security grand strategy. So all of those dynamics contribute in explaining that Russia has no incentive to leave. And they've also done a lot of basically investments in Artsakh, not business investment, but investing in infrastructure building, in humanitarian assistance, and a lot of soft power. All of that isn't being designed or done for a five-year period. So all those sort of suggest that a prolonged Russian presence is to be expected.
Dr. Hacopian, I'm curious as to what extent you feel will the regional negotiating and security formats such as the Minsk Group and CSTO have relevance for the developments to come in 2026? Will Russia prefer the use of such institutions or strictly rely on bilateral and trilateral formats?
These have been very, very fascinating developments. So for the longest time, anybody who's basically studied the OSCE Minsk Group, it was viewed as being somewhat dysfunctional. Initially, you saw sort of interpower competition because the co-chairs are Russia, France, and the US. So in the past, Russia would try to dominate, and then whatever proposal Russia would bring up, the Americans would oppose it, the French would be kind of uncertain about it, and then the French would present something, and the Russians would push back. So you had inter-bickering in the Minsk Group because each side would attempt to basically advance their own interests, even though the objective was to solve the conflict. But through time, Russia has taken the lead. Now there's an acceptance that Russia and France, relatively speaking, will take a back seat, and Russia will lead the OSCE Minsk Group, which goes to show that, whereas in the past, the Minsk Group was not considered to be something of substantive relevance to Russia when it came to solving the regional issues. Now it has, because Russia dominates the platform. So there's that factor to keep in mind. Now, why is this interesting? Well, because last week, I think Ilham Aliyev said that the OSCE Minsk Group is irrelevant, right? That he himself has solved the Artsakh conflict, that the issue is resolved, and so the Minsk Group serves no purpose. And so by antagonizing the Minsk Group, and by extension antagonizing a platform that Russia dominates, I would expect Russia to actually instrumentalize the Minsk Group to further advance whatever interest it perceives to be consolidating in the region. And so Aliyev's or Baku's antagonization of the Minsk Group might actually have a counter effect, might have a reverse effect. And the fact that Russia basically came out a few days ago and said that the co-chair should be visiting Stepanakert and being more active, and that completely contradicts everything that Aliyev has been arguing, is kind of suggesting where we might be going with this.
What about
We-
CST? Oh, go
Right,
ahead.
we respected a CSTO. You know, for the longest time, we all knew what the CSTO was. This was basically an organization that was on paper. It had no functional relevance. It had done nothing. And you know, when the developments in Kazakhstan happened,
Do you want to talk a bit about the
sure, we'll quickly
collective security treaty?
Sure, we'll quickly tie it in. When the developments in Kazakhstan happened, Putin saw a very good opportunity. Okay, he saw that basically CSTO could be utilized where they're no longer as a quote unquote paper tiger, that they have some functional operational capability, and so troops were immediately deployed to Kazakhstan. But this was obviously a very low risk operation. Okay, some 2,000 troops from from the 4 member countries landed, stuck around for about a week and a half, pretty much did nothing, and then came back. This was mostly a moral boost to Kazakh authorities and the security apparatus. Okay, but Russia did use the Kazakhstan precedent to say, well, you know what, the CSTO could be functional if it wants to. So, after everybody made fun of the CSTO when they didn't get involved with Armenia's border violations, so on and so forth, here's an example that if need be, it could be functional. Okay, so that was kind of what they did. Now, would the CSTO become relevant in addressing the Artsakh issue down the line, or in addressing Armenia's very complications should more conflicts arise? I highly doubt it, because overarchingly, when we look at Russian security and foreign policy, Russia does not like working in multilateral formats. Russia always works bilaterally. So if there's a problem, Russia likes to step in, and Russia basically works with Armenia, Russia, or Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Russia, Azerbaijan. Russia likes one of these bilateral one-on-one structures. It doesn't work well in a in multilateral structures. And so when you have serious acute issues that Russian interests might be at risk, or Russian interests might be preserved, Russia isn't going to use any multilateral platforms. They will basically operate through a bilateral structure, which has been their policy from the 90s. So I don't see the CSTO becoming relevant or operational should complications continue. And here's a very simple example. Russia could very well, for example, say, you know what, we have Russian peacekeepers, but we're going to expand it to CSTO peacekeepers and make this a case of regional peacekeeping and security and so on and so forth. But obviously, they're not going to do that, because that will further complicate and delimit direct Russian authority. And so on very serious issues, Russia sticks to bilateralism. And because they consider the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict and the Artsakh issue as being one of very serious relevance to their interests, they're going to stick to the bilateral involvement.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And we're just going to touch a little bit about geopolitical configurations. What happens if, I know this is on some people's minds recently, what happens if Russia invades Ukraine? What would be the fallout? Would this have a trickle-down effect on the South Caucasus?
That's good. I'm sure Ana would think.
Ana, I'm going to invite you to jump in too. Please do.
I honestly do not think that Russia's what many are considered to be a pending invasion or even an attack on Ukraine, I don't think it's going to have any serious effects on Armenia, on Artsakh, or Armenia-Azerbaijan relations. And I'm talking about serious direct effects. Might there be trickle-down side effects? Possibly, but I don't think there's going to be to a magnitude where it could actually change anything on the ground. What happened in Crimea, what has been happening in Luhansk and Donbass, entire the eastern region, this has been continuous. That has not resonated to any trickle down to any complication as far as Armenia is concerned. What would a Russian invasion do? From a broader international perspective, it's obviously going to demonize and antagonize Russia. And so from a sort of a macro perspective, Armenia might have some kind of a fallout because Armenia remains closely aligned with Russia, but the international community, especially the West, is going to antagonize Russia. And so the narrative could be shaped that Armenia aligns with Russia, this country that's invading its neighbor, while Azerbaijan remains neutral and Turkey is a NATO partner. Therefore, Azerbaijan, Turkey are more pro-West, Armenia is pro-Russia, and a narrative might be developed to kind of darken or blacken Armenia's image and thus attempt some level of harm towards Armenia. So those are some sort of trickle-down factors that could potentially be problematic. Also, a prolonged Russian conflict in Ukraine will also limit Russia's military capabilities for the South Caucasus. Russia is at sometimes overstretched. It doesn't have all the capabilities to cover the entirety of what it considers to be its spheres of influence. So if extensive resources are going to be applied to the Ukrainian front, Azerbaijan might view that as sort of, Russia's primary theater of war is Ukraine now. Can we reinstigate more localized clashes and create further problems for Armenia because Russia's attention is diverted? So those are some trickle-down factors that might develop. But overarchingly, to attempt to gauge whether would the Artsakh or Armenian-Azerbaijan issue be resolved, or would there be any serious development by virtue of what's happening in Ukraine, I don't see any causal link at this point.
Okay. Oh, and this might be just, and then I'm going to move on to Ana, but I have just a couple more just questions about this from you. And this might be completely fraught with assumptions, but if, let's say, Erdogan loses the 2023 elections, a girl can dream, will a shift in Turkish policy towards Azerbaijan be possible and maybe limit the irredentist and expansionist policies of Aliyev?
That would be a very interesting development. So, the CHP and the Turkish opposition tend to be relatively more pro-West.
Yeah.
And so if in 2023, the Erdogan government is removed and you see a more pro-Western government forming, any pro-Turkish pro-Western government will also be defined by redemocratizing Turkey or redeveloping Turkey's institutions that basically Erdogan has slowly been disintegrating. And so within those configurations, to please its Western partners and to further democratize, Turkey might to some extent limit or marginalize the level of support that has been giving at least the Aliyev regime. And so whereas Erdogan not only does give Aliyev a complete leeway in aggression, but also reinforces it, a new government 2023 in in Turkey, in Ankara, but will obviously not be as supportive in this kind of behavior, because it would no longer want to utilize its political capital in giving cover to Azerbaijan when it is attempting to remend and redevelop relations with the US and Europe. This doesn't mean Turkey is going to abandon Azerbaijan, no. But what we will see is a less robust support for the Aliyev regime, and it would further take away from the sense of emboldenment that we've seen Aliyev, this type of behavior that they engage in. And so those factors could kind of play in, because what we've seen is unconditional support from Erdogan towards Aliyev. A new government in 2023 will continue supporting Azerbaijan, but I don't think it will be unconditional or to the magnitude that we have been seeing.
Interesting. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, because both my parents were born in Iran, but will Iran in the next 5 years become a more relevant and direct participant in the region, or?
Iran has always been sort of this anomaly
Right.
in the region, but because they have so much of their own domestic and geopolitical concerns, and because basically the entire West has been sanctioning and pressuring Iran over the nuclear program, the South Caucasus, as important as they are to Iran, have been deprioritized by virtue of the other severe problems that Iran has to deal with. Now, assuming in the next 5 years, the negotiations over Iran's nuclear programs make headways, that US reinstitutes and goes back to the negotiating program platform, which Trump had taken US out, but Biden has suggested an incentive of going back in. If those developments take place, if we see progress on that, if some of the sanctions are removed off of Iran, if basically, in a nutshell, Iranian-Western relations are improved, then the South Caucasus could be reprioritized as an important part of Iranian policy, and we may see more direct Iranian involvement. And this, of course, would be very concerning for Azerbaijan, because Iran does view Azerbaijan as being a regional problem for them, and not by virtue of Armenia or Artsakh relations, by virtue of the fact that it's an open secret. Azerbaijan has been a staging ground for a lot of Israeli operations into Iran. And so there's this very tacit and latent animosity between the two countries. And so Iranians would to develop a more robust anti-Azerbaijani posture when should they be able to kind of redevelop or alleviate a lot of the problems that they're having with the West.
Thank you. And just one final question before I move on to Dr. Ohanian. How expansive, if at all, will the EU's attempts at being involved in the conflict resolution in South Caucasus become, do you predict?
EU's position has been very, very interesting. Initially, they were basically somewhat irrelevant, and then through time, they realized that they found a niche in basically providing technical assistance on conflict resolution, incentivizing through extensive grants and financial assistance, and that's what EU does. Right? EU is all about basically soft power. So EU is attempting to maximize its soft power and present itself as sort of a very objective, neutral actor with noble objectives to resolve the conflict. But overarchingly, would EU's endeavors have an effect? They will have a minimal effect. They will have some effect in basically providing at least the foundational grounds to continue and strengthen the negotiating process. But at the end of the day, EU is not going to be a serious actor in resolving this problem. EU's role would be commensurate with to the extent to which Russia wants EU involvement. And so Russia doesn't want to, for example, does not have the financial resources to contribute in maintaining the current status quo. EU could mitigate that. Russia needs more assistance with, for example, humanitarian concerns in the region. EU could step into that. So EU could be an important partner in kind of in an ad hoc fashion, serving as a band-aid for wounds or kind of scratches that come up. But overarchingly, EU is not going to be the antidote or the cure to the problems that we're seeing.
Thank you. Thank you. And now
pleasure.
I'd like to invite Dr. Ana Ohanian to talk about her perspective from the more regional, broader geopolitical developments. We're all very curious to hear, as we are entering a period of heightened great power rivalry in the world, how will it play out on the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan? We discussed this a little bit, but I'm very curious as to your perspective, and also how will this play out for Nagorno-Karabakh status?
Sure. Actually, one way to think about it is to look at the relationships between US, China in regards to Taiwan. Mm-hmm. If you compare, obviously, these are very different kinds of entities, Taiwan and Nagorno-Karabakh, but structurally, both Taiwan and Nagorno-Karabakh are de facto states, right. And to a certain extent, even Taiwan's security is not fully guaranteed right now. So the reason that I start with this is to illustrate that the heightening great power rivalry to which you alluded is definitely making a mark in how both in terms of the eruption, explaining as to why Azerbaijan and Turkey decided to unleash the offensive at the time, but also what are the prospects for managing and creating security on the ground, but also managing the conflict. I would actually argue that Nagorno-Karabakh is a microcosm of some of the changes that are happening globally. Mm-hmm. Few trends: militarization, coercive approaches to solving the conflicts. Previous speakers already covered with such great detail on what has been happening, but the fact that an existing peace process was bulldozed through, no matter how weak that peace process was, this is significant, that there was an existing peace process, it was bulldozed through militarily and without much objection from the international community. This reflects the weakening of the rules-based world order. And also important trend that we also see in other parts of the world is the rise of collective conflict management approaches, meaning more actors are entering conflict regions, regional powers are trying to play a role, emerge as an actor in mediation diplomacy in order to kind of score some points globally. But this also creates a problem of too many cooks in the kitchen. So forging a cohesive response to possible conflict management from such context is quite difficult. So in regards to, it also needs to be highlighted that in the immediate, if you look at the data of armed conflicts, the immediate post-Cold War period saw an increase in intrastate violence, civil wars, and ethnic conflicts. So there was a rapid increase, but also a rapid increase in the number of an increase in negotiated settlements. Many conflicts saw peace agreements. So that wave went down. Starting of 2014, that there is again, a rise in armed conflict, ethnic conflict, but this time we do not see the associated increase in peace agreements. This simply reflects the problem that we are in, I don't want to say uncharted territories, because this is a region, as Eric put it really well, this conflict has throughout the Soviet years has been in this uneasy settlement, right? So we're not in uncharted territories. This region has always been managed by imperial governance, but still, I think considering that this spike is happening against the backdrop of existing international organizations, in that respect, it's actually quite uncharted.
And can you talk a little bit more about how similar and unique is this conflict to other cases around the world? You talked about Taiwan, the Republic of Cyprus, Kosovo. There are analogous identity conflict nations that we can look at. What are some of the precedents that we can consult, or should we consult those precedents even at all?
So on average, there are various academic centers that are mapping and tracking conflict trends, drivers, etc. Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Artsakh, the conflict in Artsakh, it's usually, first of all, it was considered quote unquote low intensity conflict before the 2020, meaning that the number of casualties were low. Usually you would have, before the 2016, you would have around 20 losses at the border, still significant, huge. I mean, you can't put a number on the loss of life. I hate using statistics. Right. It really dehumanizes, but still. But what we saw after 2020 is that the structure of this conflict shifted. So we're not with the obvious engagement of Turkey, weakening of OSCE, and the weakening of this rules-based setting, but also legitimizing militarization under the cover territory, the trap of territorial integrity, which Azerbaijan has been using. But this conflict in particular is classified as a state formation conflict. These types of conflicts are a lot more protracted. They're difficult to resolve militarily, as we saw in 2020, and they also see fewer peace agreements. But when they do see a peace agreement, they tend to last longer. Quantitative studies of similar conflicts shows that on average, if you have civil wars, intrastate civil wars, not conflict of state formation, the average duration of state formation conflict is between approximately 27 to 33 years, while the average duration of civil wars in general that are not secessionists, that are not state formation conflicts, there are around 8 years. So in terms of similar conflicts, looking again at the numbers, many databases track from 1975 with the post-Cold War period being very specific, show that there are actually four broad sort of outcomes. And even outcome is a word that is difficult to use in this conflicts because most of these conflicts do not see a resolution. There are a lot of conflicts that have been settled. On the one hand, there is a debate as to whether, quote unquote, victory consolidation, meaning ending a conflict solely militarily, which Aliyev has been talking about, and directly or indirectly. You saw this happening in Sri Lanka, where the government simply bulldozed through militarily and just eliminated the entity there. Russia did that in Chechnya. So this danger of illiberal militarized approaches of victory consolidation, that these types of resolutions, quote unquote, is there. They have legitimacy. And it's this period that is dangerous that allowed Aliyev to employ that tactic in 2020. Also highlighting that he used that tactic just only 2 months after Belarus's Lukashenko was having to deal with mass protests in the streets. So using the conflict for domestic purposes, both Eric and Ners has mentioned this, is hugely important. So conflicts are used for that. Another outcome is negotiated settlements. Conflicts can end negotiated settlements without territorial adjustment. And in general, so far, in this post-Cold War period before 2014, the international policy discourse has favored this, meaning that conflict should be used by giving, granting rights and better protection to minorities, whether it's through power sharing, devolution of power, regional territorial autonomy. And there's a lot of data that shows that overall, these types of conflicts have been declining since 1975 because this associative capacities, this country started to accommodate, share power. But because we're moving to this heightened power rivalry, rules-based order is weakening, it's very difficult to see that these types of policies will work or can even be proposed. So I'm a little skeptic of that. In terms of negotiated settlements with territorial adjustments, partitions. So there's a lot of scholarship on this as to whether partitions can end conflicts and whether they will last. Again, these are also do not have a good track record. Some argue that partition as an outcome can provide is a better resolution than trying to accommodate. But even in such cases, when conflicts end through partition, war resumption happens again. So the Ethiopia-Eritrea is one case. There was a partition and then war resumed 5 years later, again, bloody conflict. And then we see, again, peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, but now you see Ethiopia is collapsing because it went after its northern Tigray region. And the last non-outcome is suspension. You mentioned Cyprus, right? These are cases de facto states, and this is where Russia is so important because if you look at the string of conflicts around Russia's neighborhood, whether it's in Eastern Europe, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Georgia, Moldova, or here in South Caucasus, Russia makes an argument that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the international community recognized the 15 states for the sake of stability, but really played lip service for the minorities inside these states. And this, sure enough, this unsettled, using Eric's vocabulary, uneasy settlement resulted in uneasy peace and invited Russia into this contested territories. So unsettled outcomes, suspended outcomes, no war, no peace is actually much more likely from this conflict than negotiated settlement or even victory consolidation. The question is how to provide security in such unsettled settings, in such uneasy conditions. What type of diplomatic structures need to be put in place, whether Russia will favor, what the Turkey's interests and capacities are in this, what in this case, Aliyev's incentives here, Armenia's capacities and incentives here, and what will happen, what will come out of this regional unblocking that was part of the Russia brokered agreement.
Excellent. And in looking at how important is the fact that Nagorno-Karabakh as a de facto state, which means a state that's just exists by fact, not by law, has continuously worked now to build its institutions and governance over the past few decades. Does it matter for status-related diplomacy?
I think overall, there are over 25 more, this is not an exact number, de facto states, meaning these are entities that don't have international recognition, but they do have They do offer, they have institutions of governance. So they maybe stand alone, meaning, but also enjoy international protection. As to why it is important, unfortunately, while most of these de facto states were hoping that if only they deepen their democratic institutions, they will show legitimacy globally. That strategy has not been very effective because there are various other geopolitics does matter as to which states become recognized, which do not. But at the same time, regardless of international recognition, these institutions are critical for in this case, Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, to provide governance to its citizens. In order to keep Armenians in the entity, it's important that education functions well, economy functions well, whether it's transportation, basic things need to function, and these basic governance components are provided when democratic institutions are strengthened. And if you have, more importantly, you don't hear that, although I don't know how negotiations are carried out, but this also gives a language to authorities in Artsakh to connect this story to the story of global democratic declines. Democracy is under stress in many parts of the world, and as the many capitals in the West and the United States are searching for solution, more and more voices are arguing for more power to more people. So crushing cases of self-governance, democratic connectivity, while also hoping that democracy will flourish in other parts of the world and establish democracy. I think there is a singular story that needs to be told, and that democracy is as strong as its weakest links, and that there is something very valuable as to how this entity is able to function and provide institutions, run elections, have a constitution. So these are just really critical, and they are part of the global narrative.
Excellent. And Dr. Ohanian, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what happens if there is stabilization between Armenia and Turkey. I mean, one could argue that there's going to be economic growth, normalization of relations, less conflict, but how does that happen if Turkey takes the stance that, there never was an Armenian genocide? It feels too thorny, like a false effort of normalization. What are your thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
I think overall, I would argue strongly, that as a small state, it is in Armenia's interest to have as many diplomatic front lines as possible. When I give talks in Armenia, you'll hear the argument, well, diplomacy doesn't work, so we should not be, whether it's regional unblocking, whatever. Well, that's the same argument to say there is no treatment for cancer, so therefore we don't need hospitals. I think strengthening diplomatic capacities, and regional in particular, which might involve Turkey, is essential to strengthen Armenia's statecraft. The question is then, when Turkey does say regionalism, what does it mean? What does Turkey mean by it? The issue should not be black and white, to negotiate or not, to regionalize or not. There is a lot of gray area. And the regional integration in general, regional diplomacy in general, comes in many shapes and forms. There is hegemonic regionalism, and it's no secret that many great powers, regional powers, will try to create such formats to expand influence. And I'm sure this is Turkish calculation. But at the same time, pulling illiberal powers such as Turkey into a negotiation table, and even Azerbaijan, for a small state, it is necessary. In excessive, while I do understand that improvement relations with Turkey is not going to completely deal with Armenia's excessive reliance on Russia, but at the same time, it really helps to reduce the rivalry, create options, and create stakeholders around the region, stakeholders of stability. The lack of connectivity makes war very likely. This is sort of a standard liberal theory from political science. But if you look at economic studies as well, it makes sense to me that if societies become disconnected for a dictator like Aliyev, it's going to be easy for him to continue milk the conflict for domestic purposes. So I would say that, yeah, it's not easy Turkey is not going to accept the genocide, but I think personally for me, and I have children that I'm raising children that have to deal with this legacy, but my approach to this is that Turkey has been paying a price for its denialism, and that price has been growing authoritarianism in Turkey. Turkey's state is weakening despite the military incursions. So I would say that's Turkey's loss, that it's unable, the same capacities of denialism that it mobilizes, it's the same capacities that it uses to crush civil society. So I would call for Armenia to continue with unblocking and opening engagement with Turkey, but also looking in a very dispassionate way, unemotional way, what was the impact of Turkish economy on neighboring Georgia? That economy, that dyad has been trading for a long time. And I don't see, this is you should probably, it'd be good to hear from economists on this question, but I don't see a lot of question, this is to me, I'm looking at South Caucasus and I'm thinking that someone needs to be doing this study as to what the impact of Turkish economy has been on Georgia's economy in order to figure out how Armenia's economy will fare. I hope that answers your question.
No, it does, because the Turkish envoy is an unabashed Erdogan loyalist. So I didn't put a lot of belief that the border to Armenia would actually be unsealed, but it sounds like you do believe that that is a real possibility.
I think, I'm not sure, I'm not privy of the negotiations. I wonder what Eric and Nerses think about this. I was surprised that there seems to be, if I'm reading this correctly, Russia seems to be interested in unblocking, of course, on its own terms. For Turkey, Turkey's, as Nerses and Eric mentioned, Nerses touched on this really well. Turkey's foreign policy has been personalized. It's diplomatic. There are not many professionals left there. So, and it's a very big question as to whether in 2023, whether Erdogan, who is not likely to win the election, will even peacefully step away, or whether we're going to see some more complications. So that's a very big issue there. But I think in terms of the economic impact, if Turkey, I guess, okay, one argument that makes me optimistic that the border might be open is that the eastern parts of Turkey, the Kurdish areas, are pretty underdeveloped, and those areas are closer to Yerevan. So creating some sort of a connection allows Turkey to address those issues. And this is where Turkey sees the Kurdish conflict more, issues of underdevelopment. Obviously, I'm simplifying this, that conflict is much more complicated. But just one example, and in general, economically, if Turkey is trying to become a regional power, global power, it cannot go attacking neighbors, or that Islamicized foreign policy actually has been costly. It did not advance, it did not wedge Turkey deep. I mean, if you look at South Caucasus, Russia did not take a side. And by not taking a side, Russia positioned itself squarely into the diplomatic front line, while Turkey, Erdogan, that goes around talking about neo-Ottomanism, etc., essentially is left out, despite spending so much military financial capital on this conflict.
Exactly. I'd love to invite another member of our audience who I noticed has joined us today, Mr. Robert Avetisian, who's the permanent representative of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic to the United States. I'm wondering if you'd like to speak on this topic or share a few words or thoughts.
Thank you. You hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you first and foremost for organizing this very important and timely discussion. Thank you for the panelists, of course, for their very interesting insight. Well, I find the discussion very interesting, very timely, as we all guess to some sort what's going to happen to Artsakh in few years and what are the security guarantees. I just want to mention that if we talk about the security guarantees as a state, as a small state, there is nothing really problematic in that we have to resort to supporting our security, especially we have such an openly aggressive neighbor in the face of Azerbaijan and Turkey, at least so far, which has been consistently saying that Artsakh, the only Artsakh they see is Artsakh without Armenians. I just want to say that as a state which has gone through this enormous challenge, we have demonstrated pretty impressive resilience in getting back to kind of a normal functioning, what Ana has referred to as the functioning of the state institutions, to provide the basic needs of our population, and we are resolute to do so. We continue our path. We continue to, based on the reality, and we continue to share the same vision that we need to preserve our state, to preserve as part of the Armenian civilization. And of course, we hope that with a stronger Armenia and stronger attention of our diaspora towards Artsakh, we will manage to undergo through all these problems that we're currently facing. Not many Armenians, and including your competitors in Artsakh, have imagined how easy it would be for Turkey to pair up with, for Azerbaijan to pair up with Turkey and international terrorism to crush through the peace process. What Ana referred to, which is led by the 3 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which was kind of a hope that if we have such big players involved in this peace process, we're going to have a more responsible attitude towards Artsakh security. And yes, we did have our hope, and we still have the hopes that the democratic development of Artsakh will be a say when people consider Artsakh's future. And unfortunately, we have seen what we have seen, but it doesn't mean that we give up. Artsakh never gives up. We'll continue our fight. We will continue to build our homeland with the vision of the homeland that we have. We will continue to strive for the occupation of our territory and for more stable guarantees, which would more rely on the Armenian power and less rely on any geopolitical aspirations. But thank you again, and I'm not the panelist, I'm not ready for any particular messages, but thank you for giving the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for joining and for your commentary. Eric or Narcissus, would you like to comment on?
I think on the Turkey matter,
Yeah.
if I may go first, Narcissus.
Absolutely.
I think I'm not particularly optimistic because I think this process is going to work itself out, and at some point it'll stop. And I think this is not my hope. It's more my concern, because I think if you look at the political incentives in Turkey, not having this opening has far bigger constituencies than having this opening. And we are, not just we, I think the world is underestimating just the utter dysfunction of that country at this point, which is going to become far more dysfunctional over the next year and a half. And if you want to know how dysfunctional, if the lira falls under 20 to $1, which is very likely to happen this year, per capita income in Turkey falls below Armenia, which is astounding. Per capita income in Turkey was in the higher end of the world average, somewhere in the 8,500 range. And in a year and a half, they would be poorer than Armenia and Georgia. So when you have a country like that, given Erdogan's policies, you could really have a Venezuelization of the country a year from now, especially if he refuses to leave and continues the same economic policies. This is a country that's heading towards some kind of chaos. And there's not a single Turkish analyst who's a Turk that I've spoken to who thinks he will leave if he loses. All of them unanimously think that he will stay. None of them think that he will actually win an election, but no one really believes he can go, because if he goes, he has to go to exile or be prosecuted, him and his whole clan. So I just think this is not likely. I think at the end, it's just sort of we'll get to a point and it'll likely stop or collapse. Opening has different manifestations. I think it's transportation, it's diplomatic, and obviously economic, those are the three that are interrelated. But that's a different thing. I mean, that's more of a focus of a later day where you actually have these establishments, these relationships set up. But if you look at the ruling coalition, who gains, by being favorable or having relationships with Armenia? And as far as helping the Kurds in what is Eastern Turkey, when have they ever cared about that? And in fact, that's a cause of concern. One of the things that people don't realize is even today, even prior to devaluation, the provinces of Eastern Turkey are poorer than Armenia, in some cases dramatically poorer than Armenia. Do they really want a situation in which hundreds of thousands of Turks are coming and going? I mean, Kurds are coming and going from Yerevan, and having that be Yerevan, by the way, if you want to know how underdeveloped Turkey is on its eastern, historic Armenia, you will have to drive the biggest city. To get to the biggest city, if you drive from Yerevan into Turkey, the biggest city with a population that matches Yerevan's or larger is Ankara, which is like a 10-hour drive away. So the border opens, some interesting things happen, because people have this freeze frame about this border open is 1993 and Armenia is starving and Armenia has no heat. That's not necessarily the case. So I think I'm not optimistic at the end. I think the political incentives will kill this, but I'll be pleasantly surprised if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm. I know Mr. Avedissian wanted to add 2 words into what you just said, Eric, before we move on to Dr. Kopalian.
Yes, thank you. No, this is actually to an earlier part of the discussion regarding the presence of the Russian peacekeepers in the region. I know that this is a subject of interest for many of our competitors, especially in the United States. The main idea, and here just to resonate on Dr. Kopalian's word, be it peacekeeping or peacemaking, the key word here is peace. And it is obvious for us that the 4 years or 5 years or the unforeseeable future is not a realistic perspective to imagine that Azerbaijan, in the face of Aliyev and the Azerbaijani society, which has been poisoned by anti-Armenian sentiments by the very government, will be ready to accept Armenians to live in a good neighborhood. The good testament is that we hardly can imagine any Armenian going and restoring its ownership of their property in Baku. We know that close to 500,000 Armenians left from Azerbaijan proper. This is not realistic, and of course we're interested in the security guarantees to be present in Artsakh as long as there is peace. And the peace is a much longer and a much more complicated notion than any even geopolitical interest. And for the future steps, what will happen, we can guess, of course, and we can analyze the situation, and we should. But one thing is clear, and it has been voiced also by our leadership, which actually coincided with the position of all the major stakeholders, is that except for Azerbaijan, that the Minsk group should resume its activities. And it is the assumed obligation of the countries, co-chairmen and members of the OSCE Minsk group, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It can be a civilizational response to another genocidal attempt towards the Armenian population. And it can be finally the serious process which will serve its proclaimed goals, which is a political settlement of political issues. The world in 2022 or 21 or 2020 should not see such an easy tandem of hostile forces, again, paired with the very open participation of international to try to solve political issues. That's why when we have major political and economic powers involved in the peace process, we're sure that the international community in their face has a much bigger resource to resume its activities, to lead the process towards a final positive peace, which will be for the benefit of all the nations in the region, and it will bring a much more foreseeable and predictable situation in the South Caucasus, which is very much volatile.
Thank you, Mr. Avedissian. I'd now like to invite Dr. Kopalian to share a couple of his thoughts based on what was said.
Sure. Thank you, Ani. I agree with Eric on this, and I agree with some of the assessments Anna made on the sort of negotiating approach towards Turkey. I'm a lot more negative. I think this is a nothing burger, to be honest, and primarily through the lens that I just don't see Turkish incentives in proceeding with the process. At best, we could talk about some regional development in sort of more rural areas in Turkey in the east, or at best, you can argue that, this is an attempt by Turkey to appease some of its Western partners by beginning negotiations with Armenia. But if you look at the history of this, right, in 2001, and then, the soccer diplomacy between the presidents in the early 2010s, all this produced nothing. I mean, protocols were actually signed between the presidents, and nothing was produced. It collapsed. And so, the track record, the precedent is not very, very promising. And when we look at the current developments, obviously Armenia has to negotiate. You can't say, I don't want to negotiate, just ignorant and bad diplomacy. So negotiating isn't the issue. But if we basically look at the format through which the negotiations are taking place, it's not at the level where we had it during soccer diplomacy. So the heads of state aren't meeting yet. There's nothing substantive being discussed. So these are very, very sort of preliminary discussions. And by simply of observing who Armenia, I mean, Ruben Rubinian, the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, he has a bright future. He's a rising star in the party. But the fact that, we're sending someone who's not a seasoned diplomat may suggest that Armenia might not be taking these negotiations as seriously as most think. And so in that context, you have to play the diplomatic game. You have to engage in dialogue. You have to at least try to process. But I don't think anybody has any serious hope this is going to lead to anywhere. And if we do see some inroads being made in negotiations, if we see some progress being made, and I don't think it's going to come close to what we saw with soccer diplomacy, but even if we get anywhere close to that, Turkey always basically uses the same mechanism that is used in the past. It doesn't initially create preconditions, but then at the last minute it says, okay, but you do need to recognize Azerbaijan's territorial integrity. And that just collapses the entire process. And unless Turkey says Azerbaijan's territorial integrity is not a precondition, unless they categorically say that, these negotiations are eventually going to collapse because they're going to sneak those in the end. And so I think that would be the most important determining factor for us to be able to gauge, would this go forward or not, if Turkey categorically says Azerbaijan's territorial integrity is not part of our negotiating platform, and I don't consider that an issue. Until I think Turkey says that, I would not take these negotiations to be anything of serious content.
Excellent, thank you. I'd now like to open it up to questions that have been posed by the audience. And if you haven't and you want to take a second to write it in the chat box, that'll be great. I'm gonna go through and the ones that we already addressed, eliminate. But there is a question by Dr. Aslan Aslanian. I might need clarification if you're on. You asked Dr. Kapalian, you say, Dr. Kapalian, thanks for your very informative lecture. We Armenians have never asked the foundational question facing our country, at least all of the last 2,000 years. In your opinion, what is the foundational question we have to ask ourselves?
Oh, that is a broader philosophical question, if you will, because we're talking about 2,000 years. What constitutes Armenianness has obviously changed in 2,000 years. So what we are as a people now was very different from what we were 500 years ago, so on and so forth, such as culture, etiquette, so on and so forth. But, to kind of bring the question down to a more of a concrete empirical assessment, the foundational question that we need to pose is, how do we view ourselves as a stateless people who are attempting to develop and build a state? So anything that we've been discussing this entire time or in the last 30 years, it all revolves around Armenia as a state. Okay, that is the mechanism through which most of us, all of us, are going to be able to achieve whatever goals and objectives or dreams that we have. Whether we have broad repatriation, whether our civilization is preserved, whether our culture is preserved, whether there's progress, so on and so forth. All of that has to happen somewhere. And that somewhere happens to be Armenia, which is the only sort of a place that we have that physically exists. Now, this physical existence, this entity that we speak of, right, can only be functional if we build it as a state. And we have not done a very good job of that in the last 30 years. The foundational question, and I will go to the foundation of how do we build the future of us as a people, would have to revolve around state building. So the question that we should be asking ourselves is, what is every Armenian doing to contribute to the healthy state building of Armenia? And we could basically, if we could address that and build on that, then maybe we could start finding answers to a lot of the problems that we find ourselves. So that would be my best way of framing an answer for this question.
Anybody else want to? Thank you, Dr. Kofalian. Does anybody else want to contribute to that, or can we move on?
Move on.
Okay. Mr. Hacopian, do we have the capacity to govern ourselves? The last 2,000 years doesn't show that. Same, Dr. Ohanians is the one who asked that question.
Yes, we do.
Okay. You don't have to expand on that.
I mean, there's this 2,000 years is a long time. I mean, you can, first of all, I'm not a historian, but there's absolutely no reason. You know, we sort of swing back and forth between this absurd superiority of who we are compared to other people, and then we go to the other extreme of, you know, we're not capable of doing what other people are doing. It's simply not the case. In the truth of the matter is, and you know, we don't like to talk like this because, you know, we always have bigger aspirations, but if you look at the negatives that Armenia has, and we're all unsatisfied with the level that it's at, we could have done a lot worse, given all of our disadvantages. And this, with all of our faults today, you know, we're somewhat, if we're not a functioning state, we're actually a very functioning society, especially compared to a lot of other cultures.
Especially with the neighbors we have, right?
Yes.
Okay. Vahe asks, why did Russia let the war begin? And why was Armenia not aware of the future attack orchestrated after the maneuver of Azeri in Turkey? So why did Russia let the war begin?
Well, Dinesh, you want to go first, or Anna?
I'll quickly chime in. Anna could take over. To suggest that Russia could have allowed or not allowed the war to break out would basically deny what Russia's been saying for the last 30 years. So Russia's position in the last 30 years has been the status quo is not sustainable. Right, Armenia, yes, you're our ally. We give you sort of a degree of military assistance, and we provide security for Armenia proper. But the Artsakh issue cannot be resolved through us. Further, Russia has important interests and obligations and to treaty, financial and economic, cultural, I don't know if it was treaty, but relations with Azerbaijan itself. So Russia is not going to sacrifice its interests, its objectives, its goals with Azerbaijan to advance Armenia's interests vis-a-vis Artsakh. So that's one thing important to consider. But for the last 30 years, Russia has explicitly said the status quo is not sustainable. So there have been all these proposals. The Lavrov plan, which is the most recent one, was relatively being pushed hard by the Russians. And Russia has continuously said, if you're not going to be able to solve your own problems through force, do not expect me to step in and solve the Artsakh problem for you. Well, Azerbaijan for the last 10 years has been basically militarizing and utilizing all their, energy resources to develop their army to actually engage in war, right? So this has been a 10 years of progress march towards war. And Russia has been very clear on this. If you don't want to change the status quo, should war break out, I can't address your problems for you. I cannot babysit you anymore. So in a sort of a anecdotal fashion to gauge that. And so that had been Russia's posture, okay? Now war breaks out, Azerbaijan invades. Could Russia had stopped the war? I think if it really, really wanted to, and at the expense of harming relations with Azerbaijan, it could have. But from the Russian lens, their perspective is also a little different. How long can I spoil Armenia? Right? Why would I antagonize and harm my relations with Azerbaijan over what Russia would consider possibly the irresponsible behavior of Armenia, right? So there has been this continuous assessment that status quo preservation is not sustainable. But Armenia kept pushing for that. And Russia's position eventually became one of, Well, if you're not going to agree with the policies or the plans that I'm presenting, and should the war break out, I've told you hundreds of times, I'm not going to come and step in and save you should the Artsakh war break out. And so to kind of, simplify that discourse, that had been Russia's positions. So to give you the most concrete answer, do not think that this war was not in Russia's interest. To some extent, there's Russian interest because instability creates dependency. Dependency requires more of a Russian presence. That reinforces Russia's geopolitical structuring. And the fact that Russia now has boots on the ground is an extension of these interests. So there are very different ways of looking at it. But there could be the sort of the tracing the 30-year development. Russia had consistently had a very clear position. They hadn't diverted from it. And at the same time, should the war break out, Russia had contingency plans where the outcome of the war could still serve Russian interests. So that would be my assessment in a nutshell. But I'm sure Ana and Eric would have more nuanced perspectives.
We have one question resulting from your analysis or as part of the panel. Ana Ohanians asks, if Armenia recognizes Artsakh, would that condition change or would?
Ana?
In regards to the previous question, I agree with Nerses's analysis, but just simply to add that this war should be viewed as part of a string of conflicts, confrontations between Turkey and Russia. So I'm not so sure that Russia has full capacity to prevent. I agree with Nerses, but at the same time, I do think, and again, I'm speculating. It's very hard. I think there's no one who can say with firmly as to what Putin is calculating. And so much of the foreign policy making and so much else in Russia is centralized. In very much that decision unit is really Putin and perhaps very few insiders. So I don't know what his calculation was, but my impression was that Russia was caught off guard. And as elsewhere, the Kremlin, Putin was very good in taking advantage of opportunities. That he's a very good tactician. So he was able to take advantage of the opportunity that was created. Turkey and Russia are clashing in Syria, in Libya, and perhaps because, again, I referred to this weakening rules-based world order, not that rules-based world order provided so much security before, but it did provide some predictability. So this war came at a time when in the United States was not heavily involved in OSCE in the region and retreated from the region. Trump himself allowed and signaled Turkey to really expand in Syria. So I think because Washington was not paying attention, it played a role in giving Turkey the green light in moving into this front lines and really changing the structure of the conflict. In regards to the recognition of Artsakh, so far, Armenia obviously withheld recognition in order to signal that OSCE Minsk, legitimized OSCE Minsk group as a forum where the status conversation, where this conflict should be resolved. I don't know by recognizing what this will do to Armenia's and Artsakh's insistent or hope that OSCE Minsk group will be strengthened. I'm not sure if it will do anything to that message. So I don't know what it will gain by recognizing. Plus recognizing by, but at the same time, ironically, Putin actually will, I'm pretty sure Putin used this argument to say even Armenia does not recognize Artsakh. So Kremlin is a very unpredictable power. Russia is a very unpredictable player. And I think we have to be very careful how we navigate it.
Thank you. Georgie Chaltikian asks, we often say that the current Azerbaijan government is a dictatorship, implying perhaps that a big part of our problem is that the regime, which is true. I'm wondering, however, if or rather when the regime falls and suppose Azerbaijan becomes a democracy, that's lots of assumptions here, but will that really bring about any positive change for Artsakh? What do respective panelists think, as the Artsakh issue and Armenophobia has really become an important part of their national identity? How will democratization of Azerbaijan affect Artsakh and then Armenia?
Well,
I mean, on that super quickly, Eric, and I'll hand it over to it. Let me just say, I've thought about that question. One thing that I would do, obviously, democratization is a much longer process. Considering that the civil society in Azerbaijan is so weak and pretty much very, very weak, let's just say very weak, any political transformation is not going to be peaceful and managed. So I'm worried about that. But assuming, looking in the long term, what democratization does in conflict regions, it creates incentives for states to resolve the conflict peacefully. I'll stop there and I'll just transfer it to Eric.
Well, I think this is outside of this whole what happens in 5 years is the ultimate question. The day will come when the Aliyev regime collapses. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. It could be 2 years from now on some wild event like happened in Kazakhstan, or it could be 22 years from now. But these kinds of regimes always have an end date. And let's not forget, we're heading towards a period of decarbonization in the world 20 years from now. By any measure, Azerbaijan is a far less relevant country in the world, and most likely a far poorer country than it is right now, and facing an Armenia that is likely to be not as poor as it is right now. How affluent is another matter. So that's really, for the purposes of policymakers in Armenia, the collapse of the Azeri regime is 0 hour. Everything needs to be done to preparation for 0 hour, because the most likely scenario that comes after that is devolution, because when the longer these familial systems stay in power, the greater the collapse. And the less there's room for civil society and the real opposition, the greater the collapse. So you're much more likely to see a Syria or a Somalia type option in which you have clan warfare than you are to see any kind of an Armenia option. One of the most interesting things in this region is almost all the world is integrating in many ways. All the states in the world are becoming more alike neighbors when you look at them politically. And while the 3 states in the Caucasus are actually all heading in different directions, 2 of them are semi-consolidated democracies like Armenia and Georgia, which by fits and starts are becoming more European in very different ways and manifestations. And Azerbaijan, which has actually joined the Middle East. While politically it's part of Europe, it's actually a Middle Eastern state. In fact, far more repressive than a Middle Eastern state. Yeah. Your average Azeri in Iran has much more political rights than your average Azeri in Azerbaijan, despite the fact that Iran is a theocracy and hardly a democracy.
And there's more, right, in Iran?
Well, far more.
Yeah.
So I think the collapse, the moment that the day that the Azeri regime collapses is the most important issue facing us and the region, because almost inevitably it's going to bring in people who are likely more radical, more anti-Armenian, and it's very likely to lead to some kind of a conflict. But that the power relationships by that time could be entirely different. Yeah. But I think it's not gonna, regimes like that never end well. I mean, let's just be as an example. When you leave the monarchies out of it, there's only been one regime that's ever been able to make the third personal handoff in familial rule, and that's North Korea. And North Korea is even weirder and more whacked out than Azerbaijan is. So I don't see, he has serious issues of who will succeed him. That's why his wife is vice president. His daughters are airhead socialized. His son is autistic. Who does he give power to? There's some serious issues there. Anyway, that's my answer.
Thank you. Varush Bedikyan asks, in parallel to state building, we naturally need to increase our military might. Our neighbors are not reasonable and will not be reasonable for the foreseeable future. How determined is our government to at least have enough weaponry to discourage another attack, especially after what we've heard here today?
I'll jump in on that because I do
Please.
institutions. So when we talk about state building, actually military building is part of the state. So that's a big part of it. The problem is that for the last 30 years, Armenia did not develop its institutions. So it was not out of a vacuum that we didn't have these weapons. We just didn't develop them sufficiently or consistently with our neighbors. Is the current government attempting to address this problem? Yes, it is. Is it going to be enough? Not at this point. And there's a concept we use in international security, the notion of deterrence. So until Armenia develops deterrence capabilities, it will not be able to stave off the relatively aggressive behavior of Azerbaijan. This is why Russia is so important, because until Armenia develops deterrence capabilities, Russia remains the important factor that at least limits the aggressive behavior of Azerbaijan. So discouraging attacks is inherently based on having a deterrence capability. Now, for the first 10 years, right, from let's say 1994 to about 2004, our deterrence was Azerbaijan's a defeated state, they're a weaker state, they haven't really rebuilt, we're in a position of power, they will never think about attacking us. That was the deterrence logic. And then from 2004 to about until 2016, when the 4-day war happened, the deterrence logic was the concept of mutually assured devastation, okay? We have a lot of weapons, they have a lot of weapons. If they attacked, we will respond, our positions are stronger than theirs, so it's going to be so much devastation, they would not attack. That was the deterrence. 2016 exposed that's not the case, right? And then what we do after 2016, we went and got the Iskander missiles from Russia. And they made this the nuclear option, the previous government did, that is our deterrent. Azerbaijan would not mess with us because we have Iskander missiles, which in of itself is not really military strategy. That proved to be false. So in reality, since the early 2000s, Armenia has not had a coherent deterrence strategy, and now we're paying the price for it. So to answer the question, which is a very good question, state building is the strong military is inherent to state building when you're developing institutions, because you cannot have a state without security. So all this is intertwined. That's one point. The second point, to discourage further attacks, Armenia has to enhance its deterrence capabilities, and there is work being done. But this is a work in progress, and you cannot enhance your deterrence capabilities overnight when you've been behind for over 10 years by virtue of the very robust militarization that we've seen in Azerbaijan, while the limited behavior that we saw in Armenia for the last 10 years. So that would be my very quick answer.
Thank you. We're coming close to time. We have a couple questions left. Sylvie Tersakian asks a scenario: Putin's Russia faces instability. How will it affect Armenia? Okay, so I guess if Putin fails, ... What do you think?
That is an excellent question, but I'm gonna let Ana go at it, and then maybe I'll chime in.
Go for it, Ana.
Nurses, you go, I'll chime in afterwards.
All I was going to do is basically give an example of the 1990s, when Russia was in a lot of sort of instability, domestic chaos, gangster capitalism, and Boris Yeltsin was the president. And so this was a very unstable Russia, attempted to democratize, but in a very chaotic state. And this worked out very well for Armenia, because Russian policies at that time were more robustly influenced by Armenian interests. So if you have domestic stability in Russia right now, what could be the outcome? We can answer that question by looking at the power factions that will be competing, the inter-elite that will be competing to come to power, to replace Putin. And are those actors relatively pro-Russia, pro-Armenia, or more neutral? Generally speaking, because Russia's bureaucracies have a lot more sympathy towards Armenia, possibly it might lean towards us, but substantively, the only case study we had is the 90s, and in current times, obviously today's Russia is not the Russia of the 90s, and we don't know how severe the instability might be, but assuming the instability is led by someone like Navalny or the democratic forces in Russia, a potential return to growth of civic society. If we talk about instability in Russia as being a byproduct of the democratic growth or democratic movements, then clearly that would favor Armenia. But if we're talking about an inter-elite fight after Putin, I couldn't comment on that. There's just no evidence to go off of.
Wonderful. Thank you. Eric, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, I think it's the ultimate question. of what happens. I mean, there's obviously quite an amount of risk, especially if we're in our current state of weakness. I think 10 years from now, when the tables might have turned, it might be a different factor. One of the things that happened during the post-91 period is that since Armenia actually sided, for example, with the Yeltsin faction, it was very clear when the coup happened. Liberal factions in Russia, that if the opposition is going to come from within the context of the current elite, then it really doesn't change much anyway because of the power relations will stay the same. But democratic forces, if democratic forces come to power and there's not a long period of chaos, democratic forces in Russia historically have been more favorable to Armenia than not. And they certainly would have nothing in common with the Azeri regime. And actually the Azeris will be the Aliyev will be very threatened by any kind of a democratic system in Russia because it could very easily lead to his collapse. So we don't know. It's a fantastic question, and it's a scary question in many ways, but we don't really know that. There's too many variables.
Wonderful. Dr. Ohanian, did you want to add anything?
This is all great. Just to add that, it's important to keep in mind that Russia's territorial size in general does create consistent anxieties, regardless as to who is on top. The big question that many policymakers, Russia analyst scholars are asking, why doesn't Russia become a normal state? Meaning that it accepts the loss of its quote unquote Near East post-colonial sort of legacies. And here the question is, why Russia is obviously not letting its peripheries go, which in this case plays an important role for providing security. So there is a convergence of interest here. But in general, I think Russia historically, considering its territorial size, but also historically, it has always had a very strong administrative vast state. So Nerses also already mentioned, any time that there is a state collapse, there are big upheavals, they tend to go hand in hand, which is a narrative that Kremlin has been reinforcing. So as to what will happen, I agree, it's pretty uncertain. A lot depends on how that transition will be managed. If Russia does become a normal state, so it perhaps can start relying on its regional organization that it created, CSTO, for example, will use them as true institutions in order to project power, as opposed to using them when it suits them. In regards, actually, one more point on Ukraine, Russia's current invasion on Ukraine, I'm actually blanking whether I talked about this or not, I took notes down, but connects to this systemic approach to understanding Russia. Russia has been weakening the norm of territorial integrity in the world. Depending what happens on Ukraine, that reinforces this war of conquest as a possibility. That's not good for a small state like Armenia. It feeds militarization. And there is, so far, it has been trying to create this Cold War divisions, which also is not.
Oh no, did we lose her?
Lost Ana.
Yeah,
I think she might join us in a second. While we hold on to that thought, I'd like you to comment on Eric and Dr. Kopalian a little bit, just in terms of what can we do? You know, what can the diaspora do to help, if anything?
Eric could start.
Well, be active, be more active.
How so?
Most importantly, come here and try to make money. You know, the people always talk about this charitable work and that charitable, which is fine. And not everybody can do that, obviously. But the most important thing is to come here and engage in anything that produces value, creates jobs, that helps develop the economy. Because ultimately, any political development, state building starts with getting rich. You know, we're moving in a direction of decent economic growth. There's a lot of, the only positive news out of Armenia actually at this point is all economic, to be honest. It's not political or diplomatic, and we need to double down on that. So most important is to be engaged, to double down your engagement and to do your bit of it. But people need to get this notion of Armenia as a charitable case out of their minds, even though there's room for that. And to be focused on strictly state building. And state building, for example, in 30 years, our diaspora, which could have easily funded, for example, a series of think tanks, institutions that could have, been helpful in state building. This wasn't done. This was not done for multiple different reasons, partly because the vision wasn't there, partly because the state was unreliable, and on some level it still is. It's to understand that the most important thing is to build a functioning state. That's the greatest mandate of Armenians anywhere in the world, is to build a functioning Armenian state and a functioning Armenian economy. Because if you do that, we have a shot at solving these problems. You don't do that, we're in a current position that we were in November 9th of 2020.
Thank you.
Agree with everything Eric says. I'll just quickly add that most diasporans, culturally, they're disconnected from Armenia because we have different subcultures. So an Armenian living in Armenia has a very different mindset, views, and perspectives than someone living in the diaspora, which is understandable because you live in two different countries and two different realities. But fundamentally, a common cause, common objective, common goal is shared. And so to achieve that, everything that Eric said would need to be addressed. One thing I would also add is the transfusion of knowledge. The more intellectual human capital that the diaspora can transport into Armenia, that is how you invest in state building, and that's how you invest in the future. So I would argue that more important in many instances than monetary assistance is the transfusion of knowledge. Because, for example, if we're going to build our military, we need the latest science, right? If you're going to advance our economy, we need the latest skills and econometrics and a business thing, capabilities or knowledge, so on and so forth. And so those who, for example, may not have the financial means, but might have the knowledge or intellectual means, that contribution is just as important as any other type of contribution. So overarchingly, as Eric said, being active and being positively active could have a lot more influence and effect than people may think.
Excellent. And Ana has rejoined us. Dr. Ohanian, would you like to say a few closing words about the diaspora's help or what we can do out here?
Sure. I would like to simply actually paraphrase. Razmik Panosyan always reminds us that we had diaspora before we had a state. And so that's one. And number two, I think the world is moving towards networked governance. And Armenia has always been a global state, actually has more opportunities to be a global state. And to add, I joined in late with Eric and Nerses, yes to state building, and the road to state building goes through the ballot box, goes through the security. So diaspora does need to be strongly be united around that idea and agreeing to disagree within that framework. But understanding the mechanism of state building and harnessing all the educational, political capital is really critical. Essentially, diaspora has a key role to play in making Armenia a network state and connecting it effectively into global structures, from diplomacy to economy. Keep in mind that Chinese growth has been led by Chinese investors, the diasporan investors, and then the rest of the world has joined. So it's always on my mind when thinking about diaspora in Armenia.
Thank you. We've run out of time, so we are going to have to leave the conversation there. I want to thank the panelists, Eric Hacopian, Dr. Ana Ohanians, and Dr. Nerses Kopalyan for taking these hard questions, and to all of you for watching. Thank you from me, Ani Shahbazian, and the whole team here at the ARPA Institute.
Thank you, Ani. Thank you very much. And thank you, the panelists. I think it was a very productive, very interesting panel discussion. Our next event will be on February 5, and then we will highlight some of the recent activities that ARPA is actually involved in Armenia, and representatives from the government, from the Academy of Sciences, and from the universities will be essentially stating or telling us what and how ARPA benefited their organizations and Armenia in general. And actually, what Ana said is exactly what ARPA is trying to do. Knowledge transfer, essentially expertise, and that is one of the most important tasks that can be actually very helpful for Armenia. So if you think you can help, please join us, become a member of ARPA, and organize a project, and we will be behind you and help you as much as we can. Thank you very much, and we will see you on February 5, hopefully. Thank you.